Hello and welcome back. If you've been following this web series, you'll know that the last episode we did a shootout of 4 microphones on a snare drum. And I had mentioned some of the criteria that had to be met as far as bleed and attack and warmth and stuff like that that I would look for if I was choosing a microphone for a specific reason. Now, on this session, I hit the drums really, really hard. And so it's a good example as if you had a good drummer who didn't bash his cymbals too hard and hit his drums hard enough to get the noise floor far enough away from that outside noise to where you could actually use the snare drum. Because really what it comes down to is that the drummer has to be good if you're going to use the snare drum. That's as easy as it is. So let's go ahead and look at this. The microphone that I'm going to go ahead and use, since I had all of these, is the SM57. You can see here that I did the SM57, I did the i5, I did the SM58, and I did the OM2, and all of those were done in the same session. Now, I don't have time. I don't want to bore you going through each one of these, but we'll just go through. I already gated out these toms manually, so that's all that's going on there. I kind of got all the bleed out of them so we wouldn't have to hear all the rumble. And I already phase checked all of this, but I'll kind of show you what you should do if you're looking through this stuff to start your session. So let's go ahead and loop our session here and let's take a listen. Okay, so there's a little bit of lag there, and I'll show you why in a second. Now, let's just get rid of this for now. Okay, so that's what we have to start with. I've gated those toms. I haven't done anything else. I just didn't want the hum of the toms coming through, and then you wouldn't be able to hear your snare correctly. Like it was in the video, those toms were humming along. So let's take a look here. You can see in my snare drum track how nice and clean that is, probably compared to something that you might get from someone who doesn't usually, work with, drums in a studio. A lot of times when you get someone who's a novice drummer, they bash their cymbals really hard and they don't hit their drums very hard. And so you get, the opposite of this. You get a really messy looking waveform that goes along and you can almost not even tell where the snare drum hits or the tom hits are or where the kick drum is. It's just, and I get that a lot with this death metal stuff. People want to do blast beats. Everyone wants to sound like George Callias and stuff, but, you're not hitting your drums hard enough for us to do that. And that's where people come in and use samples, and that's fine. But for this purpose, to kind of show you what you would want to do to not use samples, we're going to just take this and we're going to use it like if this was some drummer I didn't know. So the first thing we would do is we would phase check our snare to our overheads and just make sure that we're not out of phase and losing a bunch of good signal. So we'll solo these and take a listen. Just the snare drum, just the overheads. You can tell there's a lot of snare drum in that overhead, and I'll show you why that's good in a second too. So we'll go ahead and pull up this as a trim. I know Pro Tools has, it's just called trim. I don't know what it's called in Cubase or Logic, but any one of those should have something to the effect of a trim where you can flip the phase back and forth, which looks like a little zero with a cross through it. And some plugins just have it on there too. if you've seen that on a plugin as a button, go ahead and pull that up and put it on your instrument, and you click this guy back and forth and listen and see if you can hear it coming out of phase. And when it's out of phase, it sounds a little more hollow, and it usually loses a lot of bass. It's an indication that it's out of phase. Doesn't mean that you did something bad necessarily. It's just something we have to check so that we make sure we're getting the full amount of bass and signals going in there. So let's go ahead and give it a listen, and I'll flip it back and forth. So actually, with the phase inverted, you can hear way more bass in there. Let's hear it again. When the light is on, that means the phase is flipped. So, one more time. The reason why that's important is because, so many times you'll get a mix from somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, and they'll think that they have done something wrong. But sometimes these things just need to be flipped. Bottom snare drums, and a lot of times other drums, or when you're miking from the bottom, it will need to be, because it's just the science of the instrument. Depending on how far away it is from the other instrument, or the way the sound was created, can have a lot to do with whether that phase is correct or not. And you can get so far into mixing if you don't know what you're doing, and we all have probably at some point in the beginning. And all you need to do is just go and check the phase. And you thought, well, why isn't my snare drum coming up in the mix? Why doesn't it sound full? All kinds of stuff will happen. And it's just that things were out of phase. So always check everything first with your phase, and make sure that you're doing it for everything. And just because I'm saying that, let's go ahead and check the bass drum as well. We'll go ahead and copy this over, and let's listen to our bass drum. Pretty cool sounding bass drum too. Hitting that thing pretty hard. You can hear a lot of bleeding there though, and that's just normal. So don't worry about that. As long as it's not too much, we could gate this too, but we won't go that far. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. So there's that. Those are all good. We'll take that back out. Let's phase, get our toms in phase, make sure they're in phase 2. Here, where's a spot where we got them all in there, huh? So we got this guy, tom 1. Let's just go ahead and pull that up, huh? One of them needed to be flipped. I don't know what the hell happened there. Oh well. That's just the way she goes. Now, let's listen to our whole thing here. Alright, now that's all checked. I think we've got a great starting point here. So, let's go ahead. Now, we're going to need to get, if we're going to turn this up and EQ it and get that snare drum bright and way up in the front, we're going to need to gate it and get those cymbals out of there, because not only are they going to be way out of phase with the overheads, they are like usually grabbing an undesirable EQ kind of on their own. And then once you start EQing the snare and getting it as bright as you want it to be and start compressing it, then all of those cymbals get compressed with it, and so does the EQ with the cymbals. It starts coming out, and you get all this weird, phasey stuff coming out in your overheads, and the whole drum sounds really bad. And that's why people, will just straight up replace stuff right off the bat. And I have too, because sometimes, you do a recording, the budget is what it is, and, you just don't have time to go back. But I always try to make sure that I do things in a manner where I'm going to be able to use the stuff that I got. So it doesn't always work, It's just the way it goes. But here we go. Let's listen to that bleed one more time from our snare. It's not that bad, but I want it out of there. And there's lots of different gates you can use. But I'll tell you right now, one thing that I don't see people doing that I think is interesting they don't do is this is, if you don't know what this guy is, this is Steven Slate's trigger. This is what you would use to trigger samples on the track that it's on to replace sounds that you might not like or are not working for your mix. In here, there's a gate here, you see? And I use it for the gate probably, 75% of the time I use this thing, I use it for the gate. It's got a great visual representation right here, and it works really, really good. So you need to take the mix all the way down, because this mix, 100% would be if you had a sample loaded in here. And 0 is, so you could, potentially blend your hit with the sample. We might do that at the end of this and just see what it sounds like. But let's turn this gate on, and I'll show you how great this gate is. I'm going to bring the detail down. You'll see these lines right here come down into it, and that's just capturing more of those little ghost notes and stuff that we don't want to lose. So let's take a look. Oh, turn it on. We can mess with the hold and the release of that gate. And that means how quickly it's going to shut it down at the end of the transient. So you can tell when we get it at 70 milliseconds, it's like pop, 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 pop. And maybe that's all you need. I'd like to get a little more than that, so let's move it. I think that sounds pretty cool. Let's go ahead and we'll just use that the way it is. I might come back and adjust it, whatever. For now, that'll work. Let's see how it sounds. I'm going to turn it up and see if the little snips of cymbals and stuff bother me with the overheads, and see if we're ready to start moving forward. Not at all. I think that sounds really good. And now we've gotten rid of that bleed. Let's go ahead and open this up. This is Steven Slate's virtual mix rack. Use this for all kinds of stuff. This is usually pretty stock for a snare. I usually use this little Neve replica. I don't know what the custom series is supposed to be, but I use this all the time. It's got a really soft, beautiful curve to the EQ. This is a little bit of distortion. This is like a FET compressor, and this is like a finishing EQ that just kind of, we'll go through it. So none of these are on. So let's go ahead and so you can hear when I turn this on, this Neve console is really aggressive, and I have it at 5 1/4 or something like that for the part I want to boost. And that's like the high mid. It makes everything more hearable, and like a guitar, a snare drum too. And I'm just boosting it like 3 decibels. So hear the difference? bringing out the attack. Also boosting a little bit of 110. Just a little bit. Just to give it a little more bottom end. You don't want to go too crazy with this stuff, man, because the more you EQ something, the further you get away from something that a human will recognize as like a normal instrument, and we're not going for that in this. That's absolutely for sure. And it adds weirdness. So be careful with your EQ choices. So good. All right. Like I said, with the EQ choice, if you're having drastic problems and it's really, really dull, go back to the drums and, if you can, go back to those drums at the source and brighten them up by moving that mic or choosing a different mic. Always try to get it at the source. Don't wait until you're here, if you can possibly avoid it, to try to reshape the way something sounds. That should not be your inclination. That's not even how it works. So let's listen to this next thing. I'm boosting 12K, about 4, and I don't see anything else going on here. It's kind of adding some top end to it. That's nice. And then I'm going to leave this distortion off. Let's pull up this compressor, and this is like a FET compressor. Really simple operation. You feed something into here. It's got 4 buttons for the compression ratio. We're using 4:1. It's got an output, so you can regulate what the volume is coming out so you don't clip the living crap out of your bus. And attack and release. Now, there's like a weird thing that happens with this. When you're all the way at 7, it hangs on to it different than when you come in here. And I always seem to have it at 7. I don't really mess with this too much on this particular compressor. There's other compressors where I mess with the attack and the release quite a bit. But this one is pretty forgiving, and it's really nice. Just a really easy to use compressor. So let's take a listen to what it's doing here. Adding volume, which we don't want to do that. And this gain reduction up here, you can see how much gain is pulling back on it and the speed that it's doing it. I think that's cool. Now, let's, a little bit of distortion. Let's try this after this. Cool. And this is a finishing EQ. I'll turn these down. I usually just adds a little bit of shimmer in like a really nice way. Let's take a listen. You can start to hear that hi-hat starting to get hissy though, so. Little bottom end. All right, let's bypass the whole thing and see what it's doing. I'm going to go and change this gate a little bit now. Let's listen to the whole thing. Now, when I did this for that video, I did not put on a bottom mic, but in the case that you do that, again, Steven Slate's trigger, let's pull that out, and I already found out that this needed to be, let's see. Steven Slate's trigger, you can go in and, let's see, we'll just grab a bottom snare. Let's go back in here. If I can hear the thing, that'd be better. That's probably good. It doesn't have to be some great sample. It's just to add some sizzle. I would have put a bottom mic on there, but It just didn't seem practical at the time. Less setup was better. But hey, you can always add a sample. So let's take a listen to what it sounds like. I dig it. Let's see about this here. Necessarily you don't need all of this for a bottom snare head. Probably definitely not that Neve. Don't really like that, but let's take a listen. Woo! I like it at 7 though. Let's add a little top end to this. Maybe a little bottom end. All right, let's blend these guys. Should have mentioned the whole time I have about 7.5 dB of mastering gain on here, and basically that is to make it loud enough for the video, but also I always do that. I always run a mastering chain before I look at any sounds on any kind of a drum mix, especially pokey transients and stuff. You never know. You could be mixing something, and then when you throw your mastering chain on, afterwards it'll get squashed and all kinds of weird stuff happens. So I always just leave this L2 on here. It's really transparent anyways, and as long as it's not clipping too bad, you just kind of figure out what you're doing. That's my dog, Josie. She's excited about this mix too. All right, cool. I mean, we could go on forever with this a little bit and get it. I'm just curious what happens when we EQ these toms. I could spend more time on this, but we're not going to because I just want to do it real quick. Just real quick. See if that made a difference. Sounds pretty kill, man. All right, so let's just take a listen to what it sounds like all the way from the beginning. Well, there you go, kids. We got a natural snare drum up in there. I mean, I could keep working on this and just like, we could go on forever. I just don't have time for that. So what I want you to take away from this is test your sources. Hit your drums hard. No. Test your sources and always try to correct things at the source first. Do not try to get into Pro Tools and start mixing stuff that's just not going to work. So anyways, I love you all, and I will see you next time.